what are the biggest cases that you think are the most consequential ones, or that are going to be we're going to find decisions on over the next 3 weeks?
I'll just list a few. One is Skrmetti versus United States, which involves the constitutionality of state bans on gender-affirming care for minors. Almost half the states have now enacted these laws prohibiting minors from accessing puberty blockers and hormones. The Supreme Court will decide whether those laws violate the Equal Protection Clause. I think it's a spoiler alert to say that the court will very likely hold that they don't violate equal protection. And it'll be another one of these cases where a lot depends on how the court says that. Will the court destroy the kind of broader edifice of protections against sex discrimination here? Or will it narrowly target trans youth and say that, oh, these are experimental medications, states have a right to protect their children, and all of that bogus that, we've seen time and time again from anti-trans advocates. There's another case.
Let me just add one or two things here. One, we're going to be talking to somebody, I think, from the ACLU over the next week or two about that case. And the other thing I heard is that the FBI is now searching for data on kids who are receiving these treatments now, so that as soon as that ruling comes down, they can step in and either threaten or prosecute doctors, or I don't know who else would be liable under this ruling, and parents.
The Federal Trade Commission, too, the FTC, has started opening a potential investigation into doctors that advertise and provide this care, claiming that it's unlawful. This is really going to enter us into a new stage of this fight. The Supreme Court's going to pretend like it's just settling the issue and leaving it to the states. They're going to do what they did in Dobbs and say, oh, we're not saying this can't happen. We're just leaving it up to the people in the states. But with the Trump administration in charge, that will be very clearly a lie. And the Trump administration is going to heavily put its thumb on the scale of trying to expand these bans and using the federal government to impose these bans, which Trump has already tried to do through executive orders that would defund healthcare providers and universities and hospitals and institutions that do provide gender-affirming care to minors.
We should also say the Medicaid provisions in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. My understanding is both defund care for trans kids, but also for adults.
Yes. That's correct. And, if the Supreme Court does rule in favor of these bans, I doubt there will be any sort of line that it will draw that will prevent states from applying them to adults. And some states like Florida are already trying to apply the bans and extend them to adults receiving this care. So, the Republican reconciliation bill is an effort to further that goal by prohibiting states from using their own Medicaid dollars to provide gender-affirming care, which would be devastating to transgender people because so many are relying on Medicaid to get this care.
Okay. Next case that you think we should be looking for.
I'll pick the birthright citizenship case because it's both really important and really weird. So, Trump has tried to end birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants and also the children of temporary visa holders. 3 different federal courts issued nationwide injunctions blocking that policy. The Supreme Court agreed to consider those injunctions, but it didn't agree to do so on the merits. Instead, it agreed to decide whether or not federal courts have the authority to issue these so-called universal injunctions that apply nationwide, rather than much narrower injunctions that only apply to the plaintiffs. Now, this has been an issue sort of broiling in the lower courts and the Supreme Court for many years. Both presidents of both parties have faced these nationwide injunctions. They have been abused. I don't think anyone denies that. But this would be, I think, the worst possible time to take away the lower court's power to issue nationwide injunctions, because so much of what Trump is doing that is patently lawless applies all across the country. And if a federal court can't issue a really broad injunction, then it will force many, many different people all across the country to rush to court to try to get their own injunction protecting their own rights. And also because 22 of the plaintiffs in this particular case are states. They're blue states that are arguing that they have a right to continue recognizing the citizenship of children born in their borders. So if the Supreme Court undoes these nationwide injunctions, what will happen is in 22 states, which are plaintiffs, there will still be birthright citizenship for all children, regardless of their parents' legal status. But in 28 states that chose not to sue, there will not be birthright citizenship. So a child born in Philadelphia, where they're not a plaintiff, Pennsylvania is not a plaintiff, they're not part of this lawsuit, they might not get birthright citizenship. But if they cross the river into Camden, New Jersey, they will then be able to argue that they get citizenship because New Jersey is a beneficiary of this injunction. So it's really messy. It's really bizarre to me that the Supreme Court took up the case on this particular question. And I think it could wind up being a tool to empower Trump to further enfeeble and weaken the federal judiciary.
And this was, I think, there was a lot of very pointed questions. I think, if I remember correctly, both with KBJ and with Kagan, that and even Coney Barrett, I think, if I remember correctly, where the Solicitor General was sort of tripped up a little bit, like the idea that, like, how is this supposed to work? Where each individual in the country who is trying to protect their birthright citizenship has to get their own personal injunction. And this is going to happen throughout before it comes to the Supreme Court. And then I think the argument was like, and what if you don't challenge those individuals? It will never rise to the Supreme Court. And it's just a question of who has access to the courts and can get there quick enough before you deport them.
Exactly. So Kagan said, look, you're going to lose in the lower courts because this is pretty clearly unconstitutional. What prevents you from just refusing to appeal to SCOTUS? And that way there's never a final answer to this. And, there's never any kind of nationwide resolution. And the Solicitor General, John Sauer, didn't have a good answer to that. Because that's sort of the game that they're running. And then Justice Barrett said, well, what if an appeals court rules against you in one case, and says John Doe has to receive birthright citizenship? Will you respect that judgment when Jane Doe is born a week later? And the Solicitor General would not say yes. He would not agree to comply with the decisions of the federal courts of appeals. He said, we only promise to comply fully with decisions of the Supreme Court itself. But if they can keep the Supreme Court from ever deciding this issue, then, the playbook writes itself. So very, very disturbing series of loopholes that the administration could use to continue enforcing what I think 7 or 8 justices would agree is an unconstitutional policy.
It's sort of amazing that this has never been resolved.
Yeah, it is, right? Well, we've never had an administration this contemptuous of the Supreme Court. Maybe not since the first Trump administration, but even arguably not since Andrew Jackson or Andrew Johnson in the 19th century. Like, what we've had for years are presidents who say, okay, we follow the court's orders. We might appeal them. We might say that they are wrong during a State of the Union address, but we will adhere to them. And now the Solicitor General will not just promise even Justice Barrett, okay, of course, we'll follow the court's orders. And I can only hope that pushes a justice like Barrett or a justice like John Roberts a little bit more towards sanity and toward the center in this case, because they are going to unleash a lot of chaos if they give the administration what it wants here.
Okay. One more case. I imagine there's a couple others, but give us one more that you've been looking out for.
One more is Mahmoud versus Taylor, which is a case involving Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland. The schools have books that contain LGBTQ characters in their classrooms. Books like Uncle Bobby's Wedding, which features 2 men getting married. Some books involving children who are questioning their gender identity. Religious parents are now arguing that they have a First Amendment right under the Free Exercise Clause to prevent their children in public schools from even seeing these books, from merely being exposed to these books, not just having these books read to them during story hour, but literally seeing them on the shelf, because they claim that their kids seeing LGBTQ people violates their religious principles. And the Supreme Court, I have no doubt, is going to rule in their favor. The Supreme Court is going to give religious parents all around the country a First Amendment right to prevent their children from seeing LGBTQ materials in schools. And this is framed as an opt-out. This is framed as, okay, well, the child will just stand up and walk into the hallway to ensure that they're not exposed to this book. But the school system has already explained to the Supreme Court, I think quite compellingly, that they cannot manage an endless system of opt-outs. And what's really going to happen is that they're just going to have to pull these books from the classrooms. They're just going to pull the books. They're just going to have to give religious parents a veto over the books, because there is no way to manage a system where a bunch of kids are protected by the Constitution from being exposed to a certain book that remains in the classroom.
I just don't understand, like, what's the limiting principle here? I mean, like, if I was to tell you, like, in my sect of Judaism, I don't feel comfortable with a marriage where the woman's not working. I just couldn't
agree more.
I don't feel comfortable with that. And my kids, I'm teaching my kids, not to feel comfortable with that. Like, where's the limiting principle here?
So, I mean, that is, again, like the big question that we're waiting to see is not exactly how the case will come out. We know like the contours of the decision, but what the justices say and how far that logic extends. And I do think they were searching for principle. And Justice Kagan, during arguments, was clearly fishing for Barrett by saying, like, where is the limiting principle? There's no limit to what you're saying. You're just saying that any child at any school anywhere can be opted out of seeing any materials their parents oppose. And that is the plaintiff's argument. I mean, they really have no ceiling to what they're demanding here. I think there's a chance the court will try to impose some kind of limit. I mean, Barrett did sound concerned about this. I don't know if she's concerned enough to like try to write it into law. But it does seem to me that this is part of the Supreme Court's broader assault on secular public education, right? So this term, the court also had a case asking whether states are required to establish and fund religious charter schools. A Catholic school in Oklahoma argued that it had a First Amendment right to become a charter school and receive state funding to conduct Catholic indoctrination. The court split 4-4 on that case because Barrett was recused and likely because John Roberts thought it went a little bit too far. But there were 4 justices, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, who are absolutely willing to say, like, yes, the Constitution requires states to fund Catholic schools. And they are not going to hesitate to say that the Constitution also requires public schools to take out any and all material that offends Christians. And I think ultimately on the ground, the limiting principle will be who is the most powerful religious interest group who can demand this of the schools, right? Who is going to have the best funded lawyers and the loudest advocates at the PTA meetings who can go out there and say, how dare you expose my child to a book featuring a same-sex couple? It's going to be conservative Christians every single time. It is borderline barbaric because you're basically shoving kids back into the closet in many respects. Like the idea, I mean, we're going back to, when I was in elementary school, where the idea of like that there are gay people is just sort of something it cannot be in any way discussed or seen or anything like that. Personally, from my religious standpoint, I hate Christmas. And my kids come back from school and they tell me they see a book about Christmas. I'm down at the PTA board, but this seems absurd. But it's part of a larger movement. It seems to me like RFRA and this whole notion of religious rights superseding, in many respects, civil rights. Right. I mean, think about who's erased from this case. It is those LGBTQ kids in the classroom who won't see themselves represented. It's the children of same-sex parents or transgender parents who are clearly sent the stigmatizing message when the teacher just puts a book on the shelf and half the students stand up and walk out because they're not allowed to be exposed to a book about different kinds of families. It's extraordinarily stigmatizing in a way that I think a different, better court would view as unconstitutional itself, right? To sort of impose this don't say gay style policy on classrooms all across the country through the First Amendment. It tells different kinds of families and LGBTQ children that there's something wrong with them, that, they're so weird or different or bizarre or sinful that they can't even have people like them introduced to their classmates through children's literature. I think it's a very disturbing step, frankly, toward theocracy.
And we're going to see these books just are going to be eliminated because there's no way. I mean, what's the obligation? Do the teachers go and say, Johnny, your mom said that you can't see gay books, so you got to go out into the hallway? Or is it not the obligation of the school to make sure they're out in the hallway, that the kid needs to affirmatively say, I need to go to the hallway because my mom said I can't see any books that, have two dads in them or whatever it is. I mean, they're just going to get rid of the books so they don't deal with the controversy. I mean,
the school's going to be so terrified of another ruinous First Amendment lawsuit. They're dealing with limited budgets. They're dealing with budget rollbacks, right? They're going to say, we don't want to get sued. We're pulling the books. And that's going to be that.
So effed up. I can't even talk about it. We just did. Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer at Slate, co-host of the podcast Amicus with Dahlia Lithwick. Thanks so much for your time. Always a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Of course, Sam. Thanks so much for having me on.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.